I was fascinated to read, Anne, in your biography about the fact that you were looking at models in your your uncle's architectural design firm for a very young age, and that's what hooked you into architecture. Was that true?
Yes, that is true. It was actually, well, first of all, my uncle studied in Australia. And as a child, it's always very exciting when he visited Hong Kong every year, coming by boat. Those were the days. And it's always very exciting to see, you know, this big boat arriving in Hong Kong, and we will go there and see him out. And then he will show us some amazing photograph of Melbourne. That's where he studied. And then describe the place and what he does. And so as a child, I used to draw a lot as a result of my, both uncles actually. Mm-hmm. That prompts the early interest in architecture.
And then you obviously went on to study. Where did you study, and where have you where are you working from now?
I'm working from Melbourne. I'm working in my personal studio. I am my role is one of the partners at an architectural practice called Hayborn. Mm-hmm. It is a national practice. We have studios in Brisbane, Sydney, as well as Melbourne. And it's a highly collaborative practice. It's research-based. We do a lot of different varieties of work. Our work covers New Zealand, Australia, and also in parts of Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And also we are very, very active in the education landscape, as well as housing and urban. So to us, it's always about what is the ethics of architecture, and also how does it contribute to both learning, living, and also working mm-hmm. as well.
Okay, so very much an all-round picture, really, for you.
It's a round picture, yes, mm-hmm. indeed.
And Heinz, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself. Tell us what you're working on now, and what your interests are within architecture.
Okay, well, I'm the former principal of Jessica and Wiles Architects. I stepped down this summer, actually. For a number of reasons, mostly to pursue other things. I've been a principal of the practice for over 33 years and involved in building up the practice. It's a London-based practice. The work of the practice is global. We have an office in Prague. We run our practice as an employee benefit trust, which is really interesting model because it's becoming much more popular with architectural practices, particularly in the UK, to deal with the issues of succession in practices. Mm-hmm. My passion, my absolute passion has always been and still remains sustainability. So one of the things that I'm pursuing now is to try and get more involved in trying to affect change at a rapid level, which we very much need to do. I've been involved in many projects over the years, but I guess my main interest is in housing and education, in the public realm, historic buildings, which we have many of here, and trying to also mentor and educate and involve myself in the next generation. I've mentored practices, I've mentored architects, I get involved in charitable work, so I'm passionate about trying to deal with what's coming next. And I think what's interesting about the discussion today, perhaps, is that we're on the threshold of something pretty important, notwithstanding the pandemic and the impacts of that. But I do think the impacts of climate change are going to be perhaps more severe than what we're experiencing at the moment. And as architects and planners and people dealing with the built environment, we have a huge, huge part to play. So I guess that's my main interest, really. I've been interested in architecture throughout my whole life. I grew up in the country. I became an urban dweller when I went to university. And now I've moved back out to the country. So I've gone full circle, really. So quite interesting.
Thank you. So we have two diverse locations for a start here. Anne is talking to us from Melbourne, and Heinz, you're talking to us from the UK. So perhaps from those two different perspectives, how would you feel that coronavirus is going to reshape architecture? And I think we probably need to look at it short term and then more longer term. Perhaps you'd like to go first, Dan, with that thought.
Yes. First of all, I absolutely share Heinz's concern, not just concern, it is actually, it's severe concern in relation to the climate crisis that we have been encountering, that it has been actually a progress, but certainly now is so head on to ourselves, to us. And secondly, too, is the pandemic. It is as much about how we deal with the environment and the ecology that's result in what we're experiencing. We cannot decouple and separate the environment, the ecology, as well as where we're at with the pandemic and climate crisis. I think your questions in relation to what effects it has in architecture. We are part of a built environment, but we're also part of the society making in multiple level. We see ourselves as human-centric in what we do in order to create an environment, in order to affect the cities that we live in or the environment that we live in, then it is something that I don't think we are aware of the severe future, near future, but immediate future. We do know, and we've heard a lot from everyone too, is the first and foremost, most people mentioned, and most government would mention, is the economic fallouts from this pandemic. But to us, it's actually highly societal. And what about the human and the humans fallouts that this pandemic will result, and how we as architects can play our part in both doing what we do very well and doing the efficacy. And perhaps also too is, for the first time in a long time, it's how do we actually, probably more of us, rather than a feel, is to how to be activists in what we do, in shifting
how do we instigate
policy change.
I think there's a great awareness of change, but how does that actually happen in practical terms? Given that I think we're now going to enter a world that is going to be fiscally challenged. Budgets are now going to be smaller. There's no doubt about that. So how do we still make architecture that works for the society for now, but also going forward? What would your views be on that question, Heinz, looking at sort of short-term and long-term?
Well, I think there's an interesting expression, and I can't remember who said it, it's that first of all, we shape our buildings, and then the buildings shape us, and it's the same with our cities and our places and our environment. What's been interesting about the pandemic is that it has forced change on people in a way. Things were evolving and shifting. You know, we're working from home. Cities are now empty to the large part. Certainly parts of London are. They opened up and they're closing down. What cities mean to us is changing, how we treat them, the notion of movement around cities, the spaces in cities, but also in our homes. Suddenly our homes have become our workplaces. And I think that is going to have a transformational effect on many things. I think that we will reevaluate how we work, both as architects and as urban and non-urban dwellers. And I think it'll change the nature of our interaction. It's very interesting, isn't it? We spent the last, almost 9 months now talking virtually. So we have the capacity to discuss things virtually, and we can do that from our homes. So our homes, you know, one of the first things that we always comment on, which was interesting about what we did at the beginning of this, was the commentary about our background and how's life at home. These are our workplaces. And, you know, in some instances, those of us who are lucky enough to have, in my case, children that have grown up, we don't have children at home, it's fairly relaxed working from home, fairly enjoyable. But I do miss the collaborative spirit of working together, and human interaction is critically important to the well-being of everybody on the planet. That said, I think that a number of things have happened, again, that are transformational. Our transportation systems moving in and out of cities, because people are not going in at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock, packed like sardines in buses or tubes, is much more relaxed. The air quality in cities has improved enormously. That's a fantastic thing. People are re-evaluating the nature of what streets are. What is a street? In residential streets in London, some people have reclaimed them, and they have become their sort of collective external spaces. Traffic has been taken out of some streets because of social distancing, so people can go outside. London is a very dense city, not as dense as some, and perhaps denser than others, but the importance of open space to be able to meet socially and safely as this pandemic demands of us, it has become really, really important. So those kind of aspects of our city. What is the office? What does the office need to be in the future? How is our hospitality sector going to recover from this? How are we going to treat socializing and all of those? And whilst, what's interesting, whilst the pandemic will be with us for quite some time, I have no doubt, it will always be there. We will come to terms with it. We will deal with it. We will find a solution, not in the short term, but in the longer term. And then we will need to reevaluate how we get back to normal. People say, when are we going to get back to normal? Well, I'm not quite sure that we want to get back to normal. I think it's really, really great if this forced situation, it's not a situation, it's an unnatural situation. It's not because of economic recession or anything. Those are all consequent upon what's happening. Because of this, we have had to change the way we are, the way we relate, the way we discuss things, the discussions that we're having. My big hope is that this is the seminal moment in the 21st century when society and humanity realizes that quality of life, sustainability above all, in all its forms, economic, social, environmental, and all of those things, are going to be absolutely central to the way that we recover from the economic fallout that this is going to cause. And it's a global economic fallout. It's very interesting because recessions in the past have usually been national, caused by certain. This is a world situation and requires incredible leadership to resolve it. I'm not sure we have that. But I'm sure, I have a strong belief that humanity will find a way of dealing with it. It always does. We will adapt our cities as we have in the past after the Great Fire, as Norman Foster observed, and other issues such as, outbreaks of disease and so on. So we can adapt those things, but we need to adapt them in a way that puts us as people and our needs central above all else. And I think this pandemic has shown us that.
I think it's in some ways a timely pause, isn't it? That nothing else would have given us. Do you have thoughts, Anne, you'd like to bring in here?
First of all, I think, Hans, you put it very, very well. And I think the thought is actually, we can't help thinking about the philosophical and the philosophical aspects of humanities that we've actually evolved to where it is. So I echo what Hans has said, and it forces us to appreciate those things that we thought we've forgotten. And this is really the appreciations about our time, the people that we're close to, and it's pure human behavior. And also, just the nature is invading our cities. We're hearing more of birds live. The helicopters and all those flight paths and the traffic, sound of the traffic is something that we don't actually miss. However, how do we deal with this? How do we adapt in this through all the systems that actually make cities work? And leadership. How do we actually deal with leadership? Do we actually start to participate in those forums and a real practical outcome from the grassroots, from the business communities, from all the communities? One of the worry that we have also is about the cultural depletions of what this has been happening within those culture and creative workers. I don't know whether how it is in Europe or the UK. Certainly in Australia, the cultural and creative enterprises and institutions and what culture can make, it's suffering severely. By the way, Hans, it's very interesting, the comment that you made about the fact that we build the architecture and then the architecture become us. I believe that was actually Mr. Winston Churchill's comment.
Or was it?
I believe, yes.
It probably was, yes.
Yes. And he also made it, yeah. He also made a...
It just escaped me who said it. Yes, it was Winston Churchill. You're absolutely right.
But there's also a comment that that he made, and which is about culture too, and that is during the Second World War, of course, there were not a lot of there's not a lot of financial to go around, and particularly around the arts. And Mr. Churchill also made a comment to say, of course, we're going to fund the arts and culture, because otherwise, what else would we have? What else are we fighting for? And we often remind our politicians here is how important it is. But at the moment, the arts in Australia is suffering enormously as a very important contribution to to both our society, financial.
Yeah, at all levels, society. Yeah. Are you hearing? Has your work changed? Over the last, I guess, probably about 3 or 4 months, because I think the first 3 months everybody was just stunned as to what was going on. But are your briefs changing? Are you being told to adapt work that is already underway?
Would Hans like to answer the question? We'll take a turn. We'll take turns.
In part, I would say, I think that things take a bit of a while in our world to change, and things that were in train are often quite hard to change. I think the thinking around those is changing, but I don't think, other than kind of minor things, the adapting buildings to the health situation, making them COVID safe and stuff like that, which is about adaptation. But I don't see at the moment any great sea change in the thing. I think there's an enormous amount of discussion. There are fora. I mean, one of the other great things about this is that because we are all interacting virtually, it's possible to dip in and out. And I think that's a great thing. Anne's in Sydney and I'm in London, and we can have a conversation. In the past, we might have had to come together. I think these platforms will become much, much more sophisticated and will evolve and will allow us to discuss and will allow the world to join up and become much smaller. And I think that will have a consequence that will make our leaders more accountable, because, this is already the case with the World Wide Web and changes and things like that people have access to information. The issue really is around the validity of the information. And I think, humans talking to each other such as this is going to be critically important. But it's fantastic. You made a point there, Anne, about, there not being any planes and helicopters and traffic and stuff like that. And it's transformational. It's fantastic. But we don't really need it. We don't need to travel around the world to have discussions. I have a very good friend who is the chairman of one of the world's largest engineering practices. And he used to fly literally every second week to different parts of the world. And for the last 6 months, he's been obviously in lockdown or at home like the rest of us, but he's been effective. The one thing that he misses is the human touch. And I think that comes back to the comments about the arts. The arts and culture, the point that Anne was making, is critically important for us, because these things reflect on how our society is, but they also help us to evolve and to change and look at things in different ways. They are desperately, desperately struggling in all parts of the world. But again, I do believe the power of creativity and human thought will always find a way of overcoming these barriers. These barriers are based upon what we used to do, not what we might do. And
I think you mentioned earlier about going back to normal. I don't think that normal was particularly normal or good for us. So this is a pause that is definitely giving a window into other opportunities.
The thing, sorry.
Anne, would you like to talk about the question prior to that one?
Yes, I think Absolutely. The fact is that we're questioning a great deal of things. I mean, as a practice too, if there are positive things that comes out of it, there's an awareness, particularly around how we educate, how we actually deal with our education, buildings. This is part of from a government's initiative. And then also at the same time to the issues of housing is a pressing concern in every country and every first world country. Government's investments into safe, healthy, and well-designed public housings, affordable housing, and social housing for those who have lesser, has been underinvested. So if there's one thing that is positive, is there is an understanding, and there's also some demonstrable investment now by governments into this area. So it is a positive thing. And then an awareness too is how do you actually deliver knowledge and education well. I think like Hans as well, I am, as well as a number of us in the practice, are heavily involved in educations of at least university and architectural, within the, sort of the next generation of the built environment practitioners. But also too is, for us as well too, is the issues of learning. It is important for the practice. So how we question how you actually educate the young people of the future, the type of preparation that they need, how they interact with our environment. That's something that is a pressing issue. There's a lot of fear in children as well. I think it's a global thing as well, what this pandemic needs, and how we actually have these discussions as part of the, if you like to call it, as part of the, what we do. And it's also part of everyone's responsibility, beyond the schools, the educators. It actually is something that we do have to address. So that's where we see from the spectrum of where we are, certainly some of the pressing issues.
You're both involved in education design. How do you see that changing, that design? Because as Heinz said, this pandemic is going to be with us, and I think will affect designs for the next 5-10 years. What would you see would be an immediate change needed within particularly its educational building?
Perhaps I could offer a thought around that. Educational buildings have always delivered education in the way that we've known it traditionally. There were moves away from that to perhaps involvement in virtual learning. Schools are now faced with having to address that and to address the advantages of technology. The difficulty with that is that schools, in lots of cases, particularly in inner city areas and more deprived areas, were often refuges for young people whose home life might be broken, might be difficult, they might be living in overcrowded accommodation. So schools were really, really, or are really, really important centres to sort of deal with that and to deal with that aspect. So if we are having to move, and I think that's one of the things that this is showing us, to more virtual learning for students, universities certainly, but young children, this is a really, really, really important issue because young people rely heavily on social interaction, heavily on social interaction as you grow up. And the mental health problems that we're experiencing at the moment in our society amongst young people are mostly to do with that. Anne touched upon the fear. There is a fear. Every young generation has fear. I remember when I was growing up, I feared that there would be a nuclear war, and that was just as devastating as anything else. So I think it's natural for young people to feel anxious about everything that's going on, but they do need facilities that enable them to be cared for, to be monitored, if you like. And I think schools have to adapt. So schools in the short term are having to adapt to the whole safety issue. And it's like I was saying earlier, all of our spaces that we have, we're having to adapt them. It's interesting that, you know, offices, for instance, as well as schools, are now becoming sort of like outpatient clinics in a way, where you know, you have to disinfect your hands, you have to wear a mask, you have to do all of that, you know. So suddenly we've got outpatient centres in all of our normal interaction places, such as schools and things like that. So you know, school design may well evolve to accommodate that, to accommodate the issues. But if we can overcome the pandemic, so it's safe to come together in a limited way, then what we have to do is to work out whether we've had any benefits from perhaps changing the nature of what a school is. Does it have to work from 8 in the morning or 9 in the morning till 3? Perhaps it could be, you know, we could change, like we do our working day, perhaps change the time at which we learn and the time at which we do that. So there's many things, and the architecture that we evolve for that will need to respond to those societal changes that come about as a consequence of you know, the impact of this pandemic in the way that we live.
Anne, would you like to offer your comments?
Absolutely well put, Hans. I'd love to meet you actually in person when I'm next in London.
I've got time. Maybe I'll come to Sydney, to Australia.
Oh, absolutely. I both reside in both Sydney and Melbourne. I'm actually, my domicile is in Melbourne. However, most of my immediate family are in Sydney. I know Sydney very well. But it is too. I think if there's one addition too, is we talk about the healthy building. We talk about the mental health. We talk about physical health. It's also interesting too, is the fine tuning of how we perceive health. In the past, you know, it's been always about the physicality of it, the physiology of our health. And now there is certainly so much more concern and understanding of the finer parts of our cellular health. And that is, you know, something that also affects our mental, our neurological health. So it is interesting that there is a recognition that the built environment affect our neurological or through to the psychological and the physiological. And it's much better articulated now. It's now much better understood. And therefore it's a richer understanding of the built environment that we have to you know, that we have to evolve and actually severely change from now on. Health and wellness is the most important aspect of how we, you know, how we radically change how we design schools. In fact, everything that we design has to be based on the natural, simple thing. It's about the climate. It is about natural daylight, ventilations, things that are so fundamental to us. And why have we forgotten in the past? Based on,
very good point, Anne.
You know,
yes.
You know, yes. The value in the dollars or the pounds, the case may be, too, is the idea of the growth in our economies and also the percentage growth, the only way to deal with the progress. So
how do we measure success?
How do we measure success?
Having an environment that works, that is successful in that way to support people, or is it in purely financial terms? I think that's a very, very valid point. If we look forward 10 years, or possibly 15, because architecture, as Heinz says, I know is a very slow moving facility. What do you think would be, say, 3 changes you would see as a result of coronavirus coming through in the 10-15 year cycle?
It's a very interesting question. I think that some of the things that we're changing, I think what Anne just said is absolutely spot on, that we are, and this was happening prior to the pandemic. The pandemic has just brought it into sharp focus. People are demanding more of their environment. They're more engaged with their environment and the impact of buildings upon them, upon their health and well-being, and on the future and sustainability of our planet is becoming absolutely central. So my view is that the changes that were already in train to a lesser extent are now going to, hopefully, and this is my great hope, as I said earlier, going to happen much quicker. The impact, for instance, of biophilic design, the importance of nature in our environments, in our urban environments, Where does our food come from? How does the provenance of our food affect our health and well-being? How is it delivered? How are the people who manage that delivery? You know, is it safe? Is it secure? Are our buildings, you know, warm, you know, draft-free? And of course, you know, the impact of daylight, as Anne was saying, all those are really, really important points. But the most important thing, I think, is the adaptation of our buildings to what climate is already doing. And that the impact on buildings around the world in different parts, you know, we see horrific natural events, floods, fires in Australia, as we've never seen them before in California. These are not one-off events. These are events that are going to happen with increasing regularity. So unlike you know, the pandemic, where maybe we can find a vaccine and it will be solved and we can get back to normal, we don't have there's no vaccine for the planet. So the things that we've been doing are already in train. So as architects, designers, urbanists, or whatever, we will have to, in the short term, adapt to the impacts of that. And in the longer term, so if you're talking about 10, 15 years, I don't know what will happen, but the rate of change is accelerating. We will have had to stop the way we are dealing with the natural resources that we have currently on the planet. It's interesting. If we live the way that we live at the moment, we need the equivalent of 3 planets to sustain ourselves. If we live like the Americans, we need 5. So the rates of consumption, the rates of depletion of resources, and of course that then feeds into everything we do, our environment, the way we live, the way we travel, and all of that. So those changes are going to be, I think, pretty fundamental, but the rate of change will take some time to see any beneficial impact on. Yeah, you know, we have, it's interesting, we have the technology, we have the answers, we know the solutions. You know, we can use the, you know, the solar century as this is predicted to be. You know, all of our energy sources can come from natural means. We do not have to use, you know, natural resources to power and heat our homes. But because of the economic impact of change, it can't happen overnight. So, you know, we know that we could all drive around in electric cars, but you can't suddenly say, right, we're going to throw all the cars that we've got away and drive around in electric cars. We can, you know, heat our homes sustainably. This change will take some time. It possibly will be accelerated, hopefully, as a consequence of what we've experienced. And I think that will be fantastic if we can. I
think it will take a strong leadership, but on a global scale, to see these things
yes,
come into being. And what would be your vision of 10, 15 years and the changes that you might see in architecture as a result of COVID? And obviously climate change, because they are, as you both say, meshed together, I think.
Yes, it is also interesting too, is there's certainly more articulations around what is a healthy city. Now, whatever that means, because it is a very complex, cities are certainly the ecosystem that we've built ourselves into over the last 3,000 years. So the issues of how we actually move through the cities, how we actually engage with the cities, these are there will be changes that we have to that will be happening very, very quickly. Some of the challengings is, what do we do with our waste, including all the waste that we accumulate through our constructions, what we built? How do you unbuild? How do you actually adapt into, be it buildings, elements that is in the cities? How do we actually adapt into those things? How do we actually deal with these ways for the long term? It's going to be interesting. I think in addition to what Hans has articulated very well, the waste issue is going to be something that we have to tackle on front and foremost. And also the issues of highly processing building materials that we are using. do we change this? How do we actually change it? How do we actually reuse? How do we actually build more modestly as well? And do we actually need another 300 or 400 meters high towers to demonstrate power and success? Really? So in a sense is that the 10 years is as much as how we actually reflect what has been happening. How do we actually find some way, not to repair it, but to actually slow it down in a meaningful way? And then at the same time, supported by the servicing, that the fact is that how we deal with biophiliac salutogenic design, food chain is important, but how do we deal with this in a human services sense? Therefore, to give new types, create new types of employments, new type of services, and in order to enable society to function well. And that's where we have to invest in. It's the whole chain of the human services that make this happen.
Well, thank you both very much for a really, really interesting discussion. We could talk, I think, for a long while yet, and maybe we will in the future to look back perhaps at what we thought would happen. But thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today from the UK and from Melbourne. Really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch. Thank you.